Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue. Je suis Graham Carr, président de la Fédération canadienne des sciences humaines. Et je suis ravi de vous voir ici ce matin en si grand nombre. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you here this morning to this latest installment of our Big Thinking lecture series. As many of you know, the goal of the Big Thinking series is to bring social science and humanities research closer to the people who make policy decisions, inform policy decisions about issues that affect the lives of all Canadians. Et dans ce contexte, c'est vraiment excellent de voir parmi nous ce matin non seulement de nombreux députés venant de plusieurs régions de notre pays, mais aussi de constater la diversité impressionnante de représentants des secteurs privés, publics, académiques et même les ONG. We're pleased that 3 different organizations with unique mandates but sharing an interest in financial literacy are able to join us this morning in supporting this Big Thinking lecture. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the TD Bank Group as our sponsor for today's event, thank the Financial and Consumer Agency of Canada as our partner, and I'd also like to thank in particular another partner, the Credit Union Central of Canada, for bringing today's speaker to our attention. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Marc-André Pigeon to say a few words on behalf of our partners and introduce today's speaker. Marc-André is currently the Director of the Financial Sector Policy at Credit Union Central of Canada and was previously the Senior Project Leader at the Task Force on Financial Literacy. Marc-André?
Great. Thank you, Graham, for the introduction. So I just thought I'd talk a bit about the idea for this talk and how it came about. It arose kind of naturally because at the task force we actually worked with Dilip to do some research for us at the time. But I've also been reading behavioral economics for almost 15 years now, and Dilip's name was kind of coming to the fore and more as I kind of progressed in that reading. And the other reason this idea kind of emerged is because of where I work. And I work for the credit union system. And the credit union system has really deep roots in financial literacy. This is not something kind of new or fashionable for us. In fact, educating our members is one of the 7 cooperative principles that we think help make the cooperative business model the business model for this century. And to see just how much that principle of educating our members is really embedded in the credit union system, I just want to kind of really quickly reflect on some history. It was a little more than 100 years ago that Alphonse Desjardins got his inspiration for founding North America's credit union system after listening to a parliamentary debate about how moneylenders were taking advantage of average Canadians through kind of usurious interest rates. So, of course, he went on to found the Desjardins system, but also CS Co-op, which is Alternative Savings, just down the road here. And it's the oldest credit union in Canada outside of Quebec. Looking to Eastern Canada, we know Moses Cody was very instrumental in developing that region's vigorous cooperative system by getting people to understand and take control of their finances, to pool their savings, and to do great things for themselves and their communities. So financial literacy in Eastern Canada was developed around kitchen tables in farming, fishing, and forestry communities throughout the region. When I traveled across the country with the Task Force on Financial Literacy, credit unions were, if not the most frequent visitor, in the top 2 or 3. And they told us remarkable things about what they were doing each in their own little communities or their bigger communities across country. I learned about how credit unions were working to provide financial services to education to immigrants and lower income individuals. I learned about how credit unions were recruiting young people to help them educate their peers about financial matters, so really engaging young people to help young people. I learned about how some credit unions were incentivizing savings by kicking in $3 for every dollar saved, so to really encourage people who are struggling to kind of build that nest egg they need. Credit unions have also rolled out education online games for grade schoolers, developed experiential, whoa. I spend too much time in academic thinking here. So, experiential role-playing games for high school students. At a national level, my organization, Credit Union Central of Canada, has taken insights from the work of people like Dilip to kind of sort through the maze of financial literacy programs that are out there and really kind of arrive at some recommendations about policies that would make sense for our system. And we've shared that work with our friends at Financial Consumer Agency of Canada, who we think are doing really great work in this area as well. That report, by the way, is available at the back of the room if anyone wants it. So with that, it gives me really great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker this morning, Dr. Dilip Soman. Dr. Soman is professor at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. And I think one of the ways I came to know his work is he's partnered, associated with Richard Thaler, who's kind of one of the preeminent behavioral economists out there. And he's the author or co-author of the book Nudge, which incidentally, everyone at the task force, everyone involved with the task force on financial literacy was required to read, memorize, and regurgitate at numerous occasions. Should note that Dilip doesn't just do great behavioral research, really fascinating stuff. I think he lives it, and it's a real treat working with Dilip from a kind of academic to academic perspective because he's really prompt. He understands the importance of feedback mechanisms. He always responds to your emails within seconds. And so it's a real pleasure to work with him, as opposed to some other academics who I've worked with in the past. The other thing that Dilip does really well is he knows his audience. He knows how to frame what he's saying so that it makes sense to his audience. And that's another really key behavioral insight. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dilip up to the stage. I think you're in for a real treat. He delivers a really dynamic, relevant, great, and interesting presentation. Dilip, please come up.
Thank you, Marc-Andre. That was a very kind introduction. And as a marketer, I always say, don't set expectations too high. But you've done that, so I'm going to try my best to live up to as much of what Marc-Andre said that I possibly could. What I'd like to do in the next 20 minutes or so is to tell you a little bit about the field of behavioral economics. And in particular, I'd like to do three things. I'd like to talk about what it is, how it relates to economics per se. What are some of the key findings, the key insights that we've gained from our research in behavioral economics? And more importantly, why should we care about this field? Right? And the reason I asked that last question is because behavioral economics is a very young field. Traditional economics has been around for hundreds of years. Behavioral economics in its present form has only been around for all of the 15 years that you've been reading about it. Right? And in particular, behavioral economics first came to the fore in 2004 when Danny Kahneman, one of the other proponents of the field, received a Nobel Prize in economics. Danny was asked at one of the events after he got the prize as to what he thought the world economy was going to do in a year. And Danny said, I don't know, and I have no clue. But what I can tell you is if you ask me questions about how individuals are going to behave with respect to a certain decision, I can give you the probability that they would actually behave that way, right? And it's an interesting quote because it helps us understand the differences between traditional economics and behavioral economics. I'd say the traditional economic model works really well at the aggregate level. It helps us understand markets. It helps us understand institutions. It doesn't help us understand individuals as well as we think it should. So let me just illustrate that by showing you pictures of two sets of people. Right? Those of you who are Star Trek fans will recognize Mr. Spock and Mr. Data. Right? Mr. Spock and Mr. Data are people that economists would love. And the reason they would love Mr. Spock and Mr. Data is that they are forward-looking, they are unemotional, they are completely rational, they like to maximize self-interest, and they have infinite computational powers. Right? That's what economics demands from agents. Institutions can do that. Individuals cannot do that as well as institutions can. These are real people. Right? In this case, in the lower picture, these are people celebrating the Argos win in Toronto a couple of days back. As Mr. Data would say, that behavior is completely illogical. It was a cold day, you're jostling with hundreds of other people, you're blocking traffic, there was no food to eat. It just didn't make sense to be there, but real people have something that we call passion. They have emotions. They are not very good at making decisions. They use the context. They sometimes act impulsively. We've all done this. Real people are different from Mr. Data and Mr. Spock in that real people know what's good for them, but they just don't have the ability to do what's good for them. And I'm going to touch on that theme in a little bit. So having made that point, what I'd like to do is to share with you a couple of examples of, here's another picture. This is again, behavior that Mr. Spock would call illogical, but we see a lot of this in the real world. So let me share two examples of cases where I think the distinction between an economic approach to thinking about product innovation or development or policy contrasts with the behavioral economics application. And the first story that I want to talk about is something that has troubled governments all over the world, which is how do we get people to donate organs? Right? About 10 years back, two researchers from Columbia University were doing research in terms of trying to understand what makes organ donation systems work. They collected this piece of data, which is on the graph up on the slide, from a number of European countries. The height of the bars talks about the consent rate, i.e. the number of people that said that they wanted to donate organs, and these are the different European countries. And the one thing that will jump up is that you see bars that are either really, really tall, close to 100%, or bars that are really short, nothing in the middle. Right? I mean, as a statistician, you would expect that if you randomly draw numbers, you would see some country with a 50% organ donation rate. No, it's either really low or really high, right? As good academics, they try to explain this with how much money the country spent, how persuasive the advertising was, lots of the kinds of variables that you would measure as an economist. Nothing seemed to matter. Right? And then finally, one of those researchers, Eric Johnson, actually said, well, let me try and donate organs and see how this system works. And so he was in Denmark. The system in Denmark is pretty much like the system we have in Canada. You go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, you ask for a form, you get it, you fill it up, you mail it in, something shows up in the mail, you get a web code, you go online, you register, and after a few months, you become an organ donor. Right? In France, it is assumed that you will be an organ donor. Right? But if you do not want to donate your organs, you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, you ask for a form, you fill it up, you mail it in. It's the same exact process in reverse. Right? And what's really happened here is that by simply changing the default assumption about what people are going to do, you have changed the way in which people make choices. People infer what they should do based on what the norm is in society. Right? This is an idea that traditional economics cannot explain. It cannot explain. It in fact has systematic trouble trying to incorporate findings like these because there is no utility in an economic model for doing what other people are doing, and there is no utility in an economics model for laziness. The honest truth is a lot of these things work because people are lazy. Right? And people just don't want to take the extra steps of going to the Department of Motor Vehicles and filling up forms. We've actually used the default principle in getting people to save more money. So we've done experiments where we've actually told people, well, you're actually in a savings program, and should you choose to not be in it, please call HR. And they'll cancel your paperwork, right? Nobody wants to call HR. It's not the most pleasant thing to do. Not because it's HR, but it's just one more thing to do in a busy day. And people just stayed on in the program, right? And that's a simple example of what we call nudging or choice architecture. What you've done is you've created a choice environment where people are nudged towards making what we think is the right choice. Here's a second quick example. And this has to do with work that I did in Toronto with the Canada Learning Bond. In essence, $500 of free money that the federal government would give you if, in fact, you are below a certain income level and you have kids that need to be educated. You would expect that, as an economist, if somebody's giving you $500 of free money, the take-up rate would be 100%. Right? It turns out it's not 100%. In fact, it turns out it's not even 50%. When we first started doing this research about a year and a half back, this was in a few communities in the GTA, the take-up rate was 16. Right? And our first response was, or in fact the traditional response when you see low numbers is, maybe people don't know about this stuff. Right? So we worked with a bunch of agencies that actually spent a lot of time and money and energy educating people. And the ROI on that effort was terrible. After about 6 months of doing that, we were able to nudge the 16% up to 16.15%. It wasn't knowledge. Everybody knew about it, right? It was the fact that people just didn't have the time to go to a bank to open a bank account because they had 4 jobs that they were doing and 3 children to look after. A lot of them didn't speak the language. They were worried about looking like a complete idiot in front of the bank teller. And so once we helped them open bank accounts, we were able to push up those numbers dramatically. So in these very same communities today, we've pushed up the adoption rate to about 35 or 36% simply by helping people open bank accounts. So again, these are 2 stories that sort of highlight the differences between economics and behavioral economics. Behavioral economics has a number of interesting and important findings, but I just want to focus on 4 given the limited time we have today. The first one is the idea that people don't really know what they want in most cases. The context tells them what they want. Right? We looked at that in the, using the example of defaults. I'm going to show you one more example in a minute. But the idea is that, we assume in economics, we assume that people are rational, we assume that they know what they want. It turns out that that's not always true. Right? Information processing is effortful. Our policy response in many cases to problems is, let's give people more information. We've talked about open government, we've talked about transparency, we've talked about disclosure. It turns out people get confused with more information. They don't know what to do with it. Right? And the trick often is not giving people too much information, it is giving them the right information and then giving them the tools to digest that information. And that's a project that Dick Taylor and I call SMART disclosure, right? The idea that you give people information, but you also give them some screens by which they can look at the relevant information well. The economic evaluation of outcomes is different as a function of when those outcomes happen. All of us know we should lose weight, we should eat healthy food, we should work hard, we should spend time with our kids, we should save more money, but we do it tomorrow. Right? Today, there are too many things to do. Right? I bought an exercise machine 7 years back, thinking I would start a program of weight training and elliptical and so on and so forth tomorrow, and it's been 7 years. Tomorrow hasn't come yet. Right? And this is a very powerful finding because it allows us to at least do one important thing. It allows us to get people to pre-commit to do the right things today. Right? So if you ask people, would you actually save more money today? Would you donate to charity? Would you exercise more? No. Right? Would you do it tomorrow? Yes. Dick Taylor, in fact, had a very successful program where he called it Save More Tomorrow. People committed to setting aside 10% of their next salary increase whenever that happened. Right? It was an opt-out program. You were automatically enrolled in it. Most people didn't want to call HR and cancel their membership. Everybody stayed on. And when, in fact, they got the salary increase, 10% of it went into a separate bank account. They never saw it. And everybody was happy. They were actually able to increase savings rates by fairly dramatic levels by simply using sort of this whole notion of pre-commitment. Right? But in general, there's a very large intention implementation gap. Right? Financial well-being. 77% of Canadians say that they want to save more. Only 20% do. Right? 84% of certain people in one of our studies said they wanted to lose weight. Only 6% do. 68% of Canadians will tell you that they want to write a financial plan for the next 5 years. Only about 15% actually do. So it's not that we have problems with intentions. We have problems with actually getting things done. And this is true of most human beings. And then finally, the labeling of money changes how it is spent. This is another behavioral economics concept that is very difficult for an economist to grasp. Right? If you just take a pile of cash and tell people, this is salary for all of the hard work you did, versus this is a bonus for being such a nice fellow, people spend the money differently. Right? And most economists are puzzled by this finding. They think it's because of some sort of emotional lapse. But it's a robust finding. We've done research which shows that people, for example, spend their income tax refunds on things that they would never spend their real money on. Right? They get massages, they go on vacations, they do all kinds of interesting things with that money. Let me show you a couple of concrete examples, and then I'll start drilling down towards policy implications and what all of this means for policy and financial literacy and well-being. Here's one. It talks about the role of context. Right? It turns out that the most popular size of coffee anywhere in the world is, unsurprisingly, the medium size of coffee. Right? What's interesting is it doesn't matter how much coffee is in the medium size of coffee. Right? We actually did a study a number of years back. We looked at a coffee shop that was in an office building, so it kept getting the same clientele. We asked people who chose the medium coffee why, and they said, the little one has too little, the large one has too much, the middle one is just right for me. And then after 2 weeks, we did something sneaky. We added 2 ounces of coffee to every size. It used to be 8, 10, and 12. We made it 10, 12, and 14. Surprisingly, the new medium became the most popular size. And you ask people why, and they said, well, the little one has too little, the large one has too much, and the one in the middle is just right, right? It isn't the fact that it has 10 or 12 ounces of coffee. It's because it's in the middle. Right? And again, that's another example of the context giving people information. What they're doing is they're bringing in some personality traits. They're saying, I'm the average kind of person. I'm not too extreme. The world has given me 3 choices that are arranged in a straight line. I'll pick the one in the middle. Right? And this has worked really, really well in programs where we get people to choose the right, for example, retirement planning tool or the right bank account or whatever else. By giving people an assortment of 3, people tend to choose what's in the middle. I study this stuff and I fall prey to it myself. Right? And this is a picture I keep showing at all of my talks. 94-octane fuel, it turns out only airplane engines need 94-octane fuel. Right? So I took this picture one day at Petro-Canada because I was thinking, why would they sell gasoline that no car needs? Right? And it turns out they do it. Well, I'm not sure why they do it. But one of the things that happens after they started selling 94 is that the sales of 91 went up. Right? It's now in the middle. Right? So I think what's really happening here is you can actually create assortments. You can present information in ways that you can steer people towards an appropriate choice. Now, people in marketing have known this for years and years and years. And what's interesting is that people in marketing have done a wonderful job of making consumption interesting, of nudging people to consume. But we, people that sort of work in the area of consumer welfare, haven't done such a good job of that. Right? If you ask the average teenager, how exciting is it to buy the latest Apple product? It'll be 100 on a 10-point scale. How exciting is it to learn about financial well-being? It'll probably be 0 on the same 10-point scale, right? And of course, with some of the work that Marc-Andre, you and your group are doing, that's changing. But I think the point is we need to think about making savings exciting. We need to think about making welfare issues exciting as well. Here's another example. This was actually a question that I gave my students a couple months back. Let's imagine I give you $100 today versus $130 in a week. What would you pick? Right? And it turns out a large number of U of T undergrads, these are reasonably smart people, I think, want the $100 today. Right? Now, you can actually fit in sort of, discounting rates to try and explain this behavior as an economist. Well, that's okay. But the discounting rates are really, really, really large. Right? But even that's okay. Right? Economics allows people to be different from each other. But here's the interesting part, is if I added a year to both those options and I asked people, would you rather get $100 in 52 weeks or $130 in 53 weeks? Now, all of a sudden, everybody is rational. They're willing to wait. Right? And this is the point I made earlier, is people are perfectly rational when they look at things that are going to happen in the future. When they get close to it, something happens. Right? And there's been a lot of research in behavioral economics that sort of talks about what that something is. We've got equations, we've got everything, which I won't bore you with. But the point is, if we can get people to pre-commit today to doing something in the future, and we can develop locking mechanisms so that people can actually deliver on that promise, we have solved a fundamentally important problem in human nature, which is closing the intention implementation gap, right? What are those locking mechanisms? We could think about contracts, but we could also think about peers. Peers are wonderful locking mechanisms, right? I can stand up here and say that by the next 6 months, I'm going to finish all of the reports, Marc-Andre, that I promised that I would finish over the last year. It's a public commitment. I've got you as witnesses. And if in fact, and we are videotaping this, so you can just play this back to me in 3 months and remind me, and that's a great public commitment mechanism, right? So we can think about different ways in which we could get people engaged in delivering on the promise. Let me show you a picture that I actually took when we did the research for the task force. This was a household in the GTA. We were trying to understand how people think about money differently and how they can actually use that in a practical way to better manage their finances. So this was a household that actually used something that we call cookie jar accounting. Right? What happens is the breadwinner of the house comes in on the 31st with a paycheck. They go to the bank, they convert, they put most of it in their savings account, and then they have a budget for how much, how much ever their monthly expenses are, and then the cash is actually split across these different jars. Right? So there's a jar for Zachary's allowance and Kaylin's allowance, and then there's a bi-monthly, there's a grocery jar and a transportation jar. And my grandmom used to do something like this. I mean, I remember growing up, I would ask my grandmom for money to go see the movies. She would tell me to go look in the entertainment jar. And if there was money there, I could go. And if there wasn't, well, too bad, try next month. Right? And the idea again here is what you're able to do is you're able to label money with these different names and then make sure that that money gets allocated to that particular outcome. This is interesting. We've used it in a number of experiments, and I'm going to show you one picture from India where we actually worked with farmers, and we had a wealth manager go and encourage them to save, what we did in one condition was we actually put the cash in a white envelope and said, here's what we think you should save, right? Rather than telling them we think you should save 40 rupees per week and so on and so forth. And if we gave them an envelope, they were twice as likely to save the amount, because now it was a simple act. Now they just had to keep the envelope, right? As opposed to think about the 40 rupees. In another condition, we actually put a picture of their children on the envelope, and savings rates went up, right? People save for a goal, and if you make the goal more salient, then it improves the closure of the implementation action gap. So we've done a number of experiments that highlight this point. So let me try and wrap up and sort of say two things very quickly, and then I'll turn it over. What does all of this mean for financial literacy? What does it mean for policy? Right? So I think for financial literacy, it means the following. I think about financial well-being as a three-legged stool. So there's obviously literacy, as we know it. There's the knowledge, the ability to make decisions, and so on and so forth. There is numeracy, which is another different concept. A lot of people are literate, but they're not numerate. So they don't grasp things like compound interest. It's a difficult concept to grasp psychologically. And then there is this whole notion of nudging or behavioral facilitation that we talked about. And that's about just getting people to the bank, getting people to open an RESP, getting people to open an RRSP. Right? We need to make sure all those three things happen at the same time, because if you don't have a bank account, no amount of literacy is going to help you. Right? And I think that's key, is we need to think about our financial well-being initiatives along these three lines. And the point I would make is if any of these legs is broken, then I think the entire system is broken, right? And then finally, for policy, I think there are sort of four key insights here. One, this whole notion of smart disclosure. I think it's important to provide information, but not copious information. It's important to provide the right information. It is important to help people make the right choice by providing them with decision-making agents. Think about developing optimal defaults and contexts. Think about commitment mechanisms. And then the development of what I call behaviorally informed tools. We are very quickly getting to a point in time where your mobile phone tells us what to do in many domains. My mobile phone tells me where to be at different times of the day. I'm okay with my mobile phone telling me where to eat lunch or what to eat for lunch or how much to save. Right? We can actually do that. We have the ability to develop tools that would help people solve these problems. And so finally, let me just contrast sort of this whole notion of nudging with, I used to call it paternalism, but I think the politically correct term is parentalism now. And I think what's the important difference between the two is the assumptions that we make. When we are parental in our approach, we are essentially assuming that the institution, the state, the organization knows what's best for the citizens. Right? Under the nudging umbrella, I think citizens know what's good for them. They just don't act on it. And so the fundamental difference here is when we think about what parentalism does, parentalism is a process where you protect your citizens from harmful things that they don't know about. It's a way of controlling what an economist would call an externality. Nudging is about an internality. It's about helping people whose worst enemy is themselves because they can't deliver on what they set out to do. So on that note, I will pause and turn it back. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dilip. And now it's my pleasure to invite Christopher Dyrda, the Senior Vice President for Business Banking at TD Bank Group, to thank you on behalf of our sponsors. Chris has been with TD for about 3 decades and leads the business bank in Ontario. Chris?
Thank you very much, Graham. And to clarify, about 3 decades is actually more than 3 decades, as the gray hair would attest to. Thank you very much for the introduction. Professor, I enjoyed that very much. There was 2 things you said that I thought were really quite insightful. Firstly, you talked about tax refunds. The last time I got a tax refund was a long time ago, but I think about 7 years ago. And you're absolutely right, I blew it on something that I wasn't otherwise going to spend it on. I think I bought an elliptical trainer, and I think I bought it at the same place you bought yours. So. Because I find it just doesn't work very well. It sits idle. Ladies and gentlemen, parliamentarians and senators, thanks very much for taking the time to be here today, and thank you for having TD co-sponsor this with our partners here. I'm happy to be here on behalf of 85,000 TD employees across the world. I travel a fair amount in my role with the TD Bank. I've been away for the last 2 days. I got home last night, and my wife has this annoying habit of sorting our mail into good mail and bad mail. She takes the good mail and she leaves me the bad mail. And when I started going through it last night, I found 9 requests from 9 different charities in the Ottawa Valley looking for funding. I'm sure your mailbox is exactly the same. You can only imagine what the requests of the TD Bank are, in the sense that we're a national institution, we're very visible, and by most people's standards, we make a lot of money. We get literally thousands of requests on a monthly basis. It's not possible for any corporation to deal with that many requests. So what we do, and most entities like us do, is we try to focus on a few pillars, and we focus our giving in that area. And I'm happy to say that one of the pillars that we focus on is financial literacy. It's, I think, a responsibility of an institution such as ours. We're a dominant financial institution. We view it as our responsibility to help Canadians gain the skill, the knowledge, and the confidence that they need to make informed financial decisions. Our customers expect no less, so we have a variety of in-branch as well as online tools that help our customers increase their level of financial sophistication. It's for that reason that we have over 1,000 of our employees in Canada willingly donate their time towards the issue of financial literacy. It's for that reason that we donate more than $1.3 million a year to the issue of financial literacy, and it's for that reason that I was delighted to be here today. So merci. I think, Professor, you're going to take some questions now? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. So yes, we have time for questions. Si vous voulez poser des questions, veuillez utiliser le micro à la centre de la salle, where we ran a little late because it took us a while to nudge you through the food line. But now that you're all well fortified, this is your opportunity to ask some questions to Dilip. So please don't be shy. That's shy. Here we go.
As they say, the first question is difficult, so let's invite the second one.
All right, so the follow-up question is?
I'm Pierre Derry from Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Thank you for your very insightful presentation. My question is, did you notice in your research any difference in the size of the decision whereas if it's a large financial versus small financial decision, if there's any noticeable difference that you would have witnessed?
So this is an interesting question because the answer to that question is true not just for financial products and services, it's true for health decisions and so on and so forth. And it's not what you would expect from the traditional economics model. You would expect that the more consequential the decision, the more effort people put into it, the less they're influenced by context. We actually find the opposite. Right? People spend a lot of time agonizing about which breakfast cereal to buy, but not as much about how much to put into their retirement accounts. And there are a number of reasons for why this happens. One is this notion of detachment. I think there is, when things are going to happen in the future, in particular retirement is a tricky one because all of us love to think it's years away. Right? It's something that I don't need to worry about now. I've got pressing things to do in the interim. Plus, it's a much more complex decision. And so every time, the research shows that there are more complexities, there are more attributes that you have to worry about, the more likely are people to be swayed by context. So just to give you a quick example, with mortgage decisions, with retirement planning decisions, the size of the compromise effect that I talked about, the fact that people choose what's in the middle, is significantly higher than with coffee. Right? And that's really what we find throughout.
Hi, Professor. Robert South with Hill & Knowlton Strategies. Thank you for the excellent talk. My question has to do with most of your presentation I found focused on sort of looking at the pre and post effects of a nudge. What I was wondering is when you looked at sort of the pre-effects, like the difference between the people that would take the $100 now and the $130 in a week time, what makes those two groups of people different? Is it to do with numeracy and literacy? Is it other factors? Has there been much investigation done, or do we just sort of take it as a given that there's a certain percentage that are more likely to delay gratification?
So I have two comments in response to that. And my first comment actually doesn't directly answer your question, but I think it's important to frame the discussion, which is I want to make it clear that a nudge by itself doesn't do a whole lot. A nudge is essentially a nudge. It is basically a contextual intervention that sort of encourages people towards a particular action. But once they take that action, it is important to have something else that binds them to that action. Right? So we've often heard debates between nudging and literacy, and I think the most common refrain we hear is nudging is sort of demeaning, literacy is empowering. And I think there's truth to both sides of it. I think if you nudge people towards initiating an action and then empower them with literacy, that's the right way to think about it, right? But getting back to the notion of what's different about people who are nudged versus people who are not, the difference is really in, again, if I put my economist hat on, is in the way they think about the utility function per se. So just to give you a quick example, if I'm looking at 3 cups of coffee, it's not that my utility for the 10 ounces of coffee changes. What changes is my utility for how I see myself in the context of everybody else in the room, right? By picking the medium cup of coffee, I'm telling myself and I'm telling everybody else that I'm the average person. And so that's where the effects come in. And the two biggest sources of effects really are, A, peer effects. So a lot of what we do as human beings is action designed to make ourselves look good to others, and more importantly to ourselves, right? And B, sort of these emotional feel-good effects. So as long as it feels right, as long as something is consistent with my intuition, with my gut feel, people choose it, and that's really where the drivers of these effects are. It's not so much the true utility of the product.
Thank you.
I guess we should skip question number 3.
I don't know. Let's skip question number 3, so I'll ask question number 4, which is when you take the groups who go through the different case studies and you're trying to address a very specific issue, do you do any follow-up to see how their behavior changes over time, or how that behavior may be sustained over time?
The short answer is yes. What we actually do is, in some of my work in India and in the United States and in Canada, we've actually tracked people for as long as 3, 4, 5-year windows. We have done conditions with the envelope study that I showed you, where we intervened for about 6 months. We got people to try the, to try the savings with the cash at the envelope, and then we withdrew the intervention. And guess what? People continue saving at the rate at which they were saving before, because to me, again, nudging people is just about getting them over the speed bump. And once you get them over the speed bump and now they're used to being in that zone, I think behavior naturally follows. So the quick answer is we do, and we actually are in a process of actually thinking through a theoretical framework for the notion of identities. Once you evoke the identity of somebody as a saver, then that behavior that you've nudged them to continues and in fact accelerates over time.
Thanks. Hi, Michelle Dupuy, I'm from Shirk. I have heard what you were talking today. I come from more of a social science background, and a lot of what you were talking about today sounds like knowledge mobilization to me. And I was just wondering if you could share with me, in the field of economics, how much of that sort of knowledge mobilization zeitgeist that we're seeing right now, how much of that is informed by what's going on in the knowledge mobilization more widely in the social sciences? I was just wondering to what degree there were connections there.
The short answer is very little, and I'll tell you why I think that's the case. Economics as a field is a theory-driven field. It uses utility functions, it makes some assumptions, it has 6 axioms about how people should behave, and if people don't comply with those axioms, well, they're not real people as far as economists are concerned. So there's probably only 2 real people, Mr. Data and Mr. Spock. But by virtue of that, I have actually spoken to economists who would say statements to the effect of, if you've got a good theory, why do you need data? Right? And so that's the culture that field has traditionally brought, and I'm just talking about it from an academic standpoint here. It's only the behavioral folks that have started actually advocating an experimental approach. And it's only people like Danny Kahneman and the late Amos Tversky and now Dick Taylor who've actually started sort of bringing this whole culture of no mob into economics. So it's a very, we're at probably step number 1 of the ladder. There's a lot to learn.
You mentioned the problem with too much information, and I think that's a huge problem. There are hundreds of books on financial advice. There are columns, there are podcasts. Dump your mutual funds, get into ETFs. What are you in mutual funds for? Why aren't you using your TFSA? And I think the average person is overwhelmed and just gives up. So what strategy or what recommendations would you make to cut through the noise and advocate the smart disclosure you spoke of?
The idea behind smart disclosure is that you can develop simple technological tools that allow a user to A, specify the frame from which they draw information. So I can actually have a web crawler that says, here is a list of 10 things that people that I trust, and I'm going to draw on those. And then to somehow combine that information in a meaningful way using simple algorithms and models to make recommendations, right? So for example, I could say, well, here are 3 online websites that I'm going to believe in. Here's the recommendations they make. And if I match my own goals with the kinds of things that these websites are talking about, my best fit is with this one, and I'm going to follow that recommendation. And so smart disclosure actually does that. It actually gives people an array of choices in terms of advice that other people would give them, but then it says, for people like you, this is the piece of advice that sort of has been trusted the most or has been benefited. So the feedback loop that Marc-André talked about is key. Is with smart disclosure, we need to have the ability of giving people information and advice and then collecting their thoughts and their feedback on how well that worked for them. And then we can start using simple matching algorithms to make that work.
Are you going to build that website?
Actually, yes. We are working on it. Yeah.
That was a public commitment.
That's a public commitment. The commitment was we're working on it. So.
Hi, my name is Graham Esau. I run a small nonprofit, so I'll selfishly ask, what can behavioral economics teach us about donating?
Oh God, where do I begin? Two things. The pre-commitment idea is big, but I think the goal idea is bigger. You want to make sure that your fundraising campaigns appeal to individual goals at the psychological level and not the economic level. And I think the moment you do that, you'll see a dramatic difference. What will end up happening is and we've worked with a number of not-for-profits before, is by doing that, you get a smaller number of more loyal donors. You get a smaller number of higher value donors. And I'm happy to talk offline about some of the successes we've had in India and Thailand employing that idea.
Just imagine you have a magic wand, you're the Minister of Finance, and you want to move away from being a parenting, paternalistic state to a facilitating, nudging state. What are the three things you would do that are effective to increase financial literacy and meet some policy goals that are significant? The three things.
So I think I sort of had flavors of those three things on one of the slides, but I think the first thing has to do with looking at defaults. Those are key. I think defaults shape behavior in ways that nothing else shapes behavior. We know people are lazy, so let's use the fact that they are lazy to get them to do things that are good for them. So looking at the right default in terms of if people were born with RESP accounts, right, but they could choose to withdraw them, isn't that lovely? I suspect the adoption rate would dramatically skyrocket. Or if people, the moment they joined a job, people were endowed with an RRSP. Or people were endowed with a tax-saving account. So thinking through defaults, I think, would be clearly the number one thing to think about. The second thing, if I wave my magic wand, I would like to do is to, again, get more people to develop technological tools to help individuals make better decisions. And this is the numeracy leg of the problem. I think one of the challenges with numeracy is that because it is psychologically such a difficult thing to grasp, we now have the ability to deliver numeracy through an iPhone or a BlackBerry, depending on how long the BlackBerry lives, and so on and so forth. Right? So why don't we use that? Let's develop a family of tools. Let's develop simple mathematical crutches, if you will, to help people master the notion of numeracy. And then finally, I guess the third thing I would say is the notion of gamification, which is making everything fun. One of the things we don't do a good job of, not just in this country, but everywhere in the world, is we don't make financial literacy fun. Again, with some of your work, that's changing. But if kids today are speaking the language of Mario Kart, why don't we have a Mario Kart financial well-being game? If kids are speaking the language of football, why don't we have a football financial literacy game? Why don't we have a roller coaster tycoon? Why don't we have a hockey tycoon game? Why don't we try and engage with our audience using the language that they do? And I'm actually going to say a fourth thing too, and that's simplify. And I think that's one of the things that our research has been telling us consistently across domains. Simplify what we tell people. We were just talking about letters that the British government mails to people that owe them taxes. It takes you up to page 4 to figure out that you owe them taxes. I mean, they're just like densely worded letters. And the nudge unit has now started experimenting by putting just below the subject line of the letter in a little box, a simple sentence in plain English, and this is not even English, pay your taxes or lose your car, exclamation mark. Right? In some cases, they put pictures of the car in the letter, and that was actually inspired by the envelope research that we talked about. And compliance rates have shot up dramatically. The idea is just making things simple, making things vivid. Our forms are complex. If we can just simplify things, that would make a big difference. So 4 prescriptions.
Terrific. Thank you, Dilip. The financial literacy in hockey might be a bit of a sensitive issue at the moment. But, before we end our time here today, I'd like to invite Michael Chong, the MP from Wellington-Halton Hills, to say a few words, present Dilip with a small token of our appreciation. And for those of you who don't know, it's thanks to Michael that we're able to use this beautiful parliamentary cafeteria to hold these big thinking breakfasts. So please welcome Michael.
Well, bienvenue à tous. Bon matin. First, I want to recognize a number of my colleagues that are here this morning. They've come to listen to your discussion this morning. Je veux dire aussi merci à M. Graham Carr et la Fédération canadienne, mais c'est pas canadienne, c'est la Fédération. Oh, OK, canadienne des sciences humaines. Et merci à tous pour nous assister ce matin. Nous avons un petit cadeau pour vous, Mr. Soman, pour votre discours. And I also want to thank you for your interesting talk this morning. You know, pretty much all government policy to this for generations has been based on an assumption that citizens act in a rational manner and act to maximize their own self-interest. But clearly, your research is showing in the area of behavioral economics that that's not necessarily the case, and that there may be other ways for us to formulate policy that will maximize benefits for Canadians. So thank you very much for coming here to Parliament Hill to give us these ideas and to help inform us on how we can do our jobs better here in the nation's capital. So we have a little gift for you, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Michael. I hope you will all agree with me that we've had a really a wonderful, stimulating presentation this morning pour terminer notre série de petits causeries voire grands pour l'automne 2012. I want to thank all of you for coming out here this morning. But I also want to take a moment to thank again our partners who helped us deliver this morning's lecture, the TD Bank Group, the Credit Union Central of Canada, and the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada for supporting this event. Et même nos amis au Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines pour tout l'appui qu'ils nous donnent au travers de l'année. Hopefully by now you've also noticed our new banner, those of you who've been to Federation events before, and we've left a small token of our new look on your table. We're still the Canadian Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, but we're rallying around a new tagline, Ideas Canada, Les Idées Canada. And hopefully, as this morning's presentation by Dilip demonstrates, there are lots of great ideas circulating in the social sciences and humanities community that are very relevant to the work that all of us do in the public policy sphere. And if you'd like to learn more about the Federation, I'd invite you to follow the link to our new website, which is on the cards in front of you. And if you've enjoyed this morning's big thinking lecture, just to let you know that we're taking a pause for the holiday break, but we'll be returning symbolically on the 14th of February for the next big thinking lecture. So I hope to see you there. Meanwhile, as Dilip already indicated, a video of today's lecture will be posted shortly on our website. Encore une fois, je vous remercie d'être venu ce matin en si grand nombre. Go call HR and start the rest of your day. Thank you.